Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into, well, one of history's most perplexing questions, really. How did Adolf Hitler, a guy described by biographers as, unremarkable artist and kind of an empty vessel outside his political life, rise from just utter obscurity to become the dictator of Germany and ultimately the instigator of the Holocaust? It's such an improbable ascent. It really defies simple explanations. We're drawing from a fascinating stack of sources here, including excerpts from The Ascent of Hitler, from artist to dictator, and insights from authors like Ian Kershaw, Carl Schleines, Dr. Benjamin Hett, and Despina Strategakos. Our mission today is to extract surprising nuggets of knowledge that help explain how this actually happened.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is that the sheer devastation left in Hitler's wake makes us ask not just what happened, but how. How could a person with, well, apparently few genuine friends, a really overinflated view of his own intellect, and absolutely no inborn connections, how could he possibly capture the German imagination like that? This deep dive hopefully will connect some of those dots between his personal journey, the unexpected emergence of certain talents, and the unique, chaotic historical context that, frankly, allowed him to flourish. It's a pretty chilling case study in how a society can become vulnerable to radicalization.
You might expect, a future dictator to have had this grand, maybe even sinister early life, full of dark omens or something. But our sources paint a strikingly different picture, almost unbelievably mundane, actually. It's a real paradox. Ian Kershaw, who's a leading biographer, describes Hitler as basically a non-entity, a mediocrity, a failure. His early childhood was apparently relatively normal, apart from what Kershaw notes were beatings from his harsh authoritarian father.
Right, and what's astonishing isn't just that he was a non-entity, but that his very mediocrity, his apparent lack of any fixed ideology in his early life might have been a kind of perverse strength. He was sort of an empty canvas, you could say, ready to be molded by circumstances and later project whatever the disillusioned populace desperately wanted to see.
And he certainly wasn't some kind of prodigy.
Yeah.
As an adolescent, he became sullen and friendless, didn't even finish high school. And then from 1905 to 1907, the sources say he just sponged off of his mother. In 1907, there's a famous story. He failed to win admission to art school, lived in Vienna making these grand pronouncements about art, architecture, and culture, but apparently rarely making any serious effort to actually secure a future in art himself.
No, not really.
By 1909, he was living in a flop house for the homeless, supporting himself by selling cheap paintings of city scenes. Just imagine.
It really puts into perspective this notion of a blank slate. I mean, here's someone who, in 1913, actually fled to Munich specifically to avoid the Austrian authorities. Why? Because they'd noticed he dodged mandatory military service. His life was just aimless, defined by avoidance and, well, failure.
So if he was such a non-entity, such a failure, where did his trajectory change? I mean, where did this blank slate start getting written on?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really seems it was the German military, specifically during World War I, where Hitler found some kind of direction for the very first time. This wasn't just a job for him. It was structure, it was purpose, and ultimately it became his springboard into politics.
A springboard, okay.
Yeah, Kershaw notes that military service gave him a place in the world for the first time. Even though apparently many of his fellow soldiers still viewed him as kind of a socially awkward oddball and prude.
So he finally found a place, but he was still an outsider in many ways. When did the supposed talent start to emerge?
Okay, so after Germany admitted defeat, while Hitler himself was actually recovering from a mustard gas attack, a horrific chemical weapon used back then, he returned to his regiment in Munich. Carl Schleines, a historian known for his work on Nazi social history, points out he then got a job with the information unit, working in military intelligence.
Military intelligence, that seems significant.
He was a critical development, according to Schleines. The Army actually sent him to attend university lectures on German history, socialism, Bolshevism, but all taught from a distinctly right-wing perspective. And he particularly ate up the words, as the source says, of an economist named Gottfried Führer and a historian, Karl Alexander von Müller.
And this is where the surprising discovery happens, isn't it? The rhetoric thing.
Precisely. It was Müller who noticed that Hitler had a talent for rhetoric. He could speak. And Müller's recommendations helped Hitler secure a job within the intelligence unit as a spy, specifically tasked with keeping tabs on the German Workers' Party. So the army essentially cultivated the very talent that would later help destroy the republic they were supposed to protect.
So this isn't just another assignment for Hitler. This seemingly minor role, being a military spy, was about to unleash something huge. He was sent to spy on this tiny right-wing group, but his role quickly flipped on its head.
Yeah, it's quite the story.
Schleunz tells us it was Hitler's sheer power as a speaker that turned him from informer to party member. Apparently, during a German Workers' Party lecture, someone suggested Bavaria might break away from the rest of Germany, splinter the country.
Right, think about the irony there. Here's Hitler, a German nationalist to the core, tasked with just observing this group. And he finds himself so appalled by this idea of splitting Germany that he just can't hold back. He stands up, completely unprompted, and argues against it, passionately.
And they noticed.
Oh, they noticed. The leader of the party was apparently so impressed with his speaking style, he immediately asked him to join.
Incredible. And so, just a few days later, September 12th, 1919, Hitler becomes the 55th member of the party, and get this, with the full permission of the army. It's chilling, isn't it? To think how one single impromptu outburst could set such a horrifying chain of events in motion.
It really raises that important question that so many historians grapple with. Why this particular group and why this speaker?
Yeah.
Especially when, as Kershaw notes, there were something like approximately 70 right-wing groups in Germany after World War I. 70.
So what made this one different?
Well, this is where that historical context becomes the crucial soil for his growth, as Schleunz puts it. Schleunz argues that what made the German Workers' Party different was, yes, Hitler's speaker talent and tactics, definitely. But beyond that, the immense chaos, the deep, profound resentment just permeating Germany at that time, that was the soil that made his growth possible.
So it wasn't just what he said, but when he said it and who he was saying it to. What was Germany actually like then? Paint us a picture.
Okay, well, the German people were in deep, deep shock after losing World War I. You have to remember, they'd been fed this constant diet of propaganda throughout the war. They were told they were winning, victory was just around the corner, sacrifices were necessary because it was almost over.
And then suddenly,
they're told, we lost the war. Just like that. They were facing rampant food shortages, coal shortages. The end of the war left millions killed and wounded. It was devastating.
how did people cope with that kind of whiplash?
Well, to process this sudden catastrophic defeat, many desperately sought an explanation, one that, crucially, absolved them of blame. Schleunz explains that many turned to conspiracy theories, particularly the insidious idea that Jewish people on the home front had somehow stabbed Germany in the back.
The infamous Dolchstoß legend, the stab-in-the-back myth.
Exactly, and for someone like Hitler, who offered a simple, powerful, emotionally charged scapegoat, well, as Schleunz says, the situation is ripe.
That's incredibly powerful, the idea that a nation's collective desperation could create such fertile ground for hate. So, okay, what does this all mean for his rise within the party itself? How did this initial speaking talent translate into actual absolute control beyond just getting people in the door?
Right, because talent alone isn't enough, is it? You need ambition, strategy. Kershaw highlights that Hitler quickly became a fiery speaker on the beer hall circuit. And he was apparently willing to risk the humiliation of low turnout by organizing rallies in really large spaces. He thought big.
Taking risks.
Exactly. And his organizing talents propelled him to the top of the party's leadership. It wasn't just the speeches, it was the drive, the organization behind them. He was strategic.
And by 1920, he and some other leaders changed the party name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or, Nazi for short. And then the consolidation of power seems incredibly swift.
Absolutely. By 1921, Hitler was voted chairman of the party and took total control. And Schleunz adds that this once tiny group began to draw new members, absorbing other right-wing groups along the way. But what's chilling is the contrast Kershaw and Schleunz paint. In person, apparently he remained a cold presence.
Really?
Yeah, Schleunz describes him as really sort of a dull person, except when he appears before an audience when somehow a switch is turned on. You could apparently milk an audience and shape it and get it to feel. It was almost like a theatrical performance, a kind of dark genius.
That's a fascinating insight, this complete split between the public persona and the private self. So what happens after he takes control of the party? How does he move from the beer halls onto the national stage?
What's really interesting here is that Hitler, despite his initial reliance on that raw, forceful rhetoric, he realized pretty early on that brute force alone wasn't going to win him national power. This was actually a critical strategic pivot for him.
A pivot? How so?
Dr. Benjamin Hett, who's a scholar specializing in 20th century Germany and totalitarian regimes, explains this really well. He points out that after the failed 1923 beer hall putsch, That brazen, almost clumsy armed attempt to seize power in Munich that literally started in a beer hall.
Right, the failed coup.
Exactly. After that failed, Hitler was apparently smart enough to realize that he and his party could not come to power with violence against the institutions of the state. Not directly, anyway. Instead, Het says they could only come to power by getting inside the system, and the path to that was through winning elections.
So a massive failure, a failed coup, actually became a stepping stone. That's definitely one of those surprising nuggets.
It really was. While the putsch itself failed miserably, his subsequent trial became like a megaphone for broadcasting his ideas. It gave him a national audience he never had before.
He used the courtroom as a stage.
Totally. And his surprisingly light 9-month stint in prison gave him the time and opportunity to dictate his book, the almost unreadable, according to many, but wildly popular biography, Mein Kampf. He basically turned a political catastrophe into a massive propaganda victory.
Okay, so elections are the new path, but what else helped him gain wider acceptance?
Well, there were definitely many factors. The devastating economic depression of the late 20s and early 30s played a huge role. Widespread hatred of the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed those harsh reparations on Germany. But Despina Stratigakos, a scholar whose work focuses on architecture and propaganda, highlights something truly, almost chillingly modern. She talks about how Hitler used mass media to completely rehabilitate his personal image, especially when he was struggling to reach middle-class voters in the 1932 presidential election.
Rehabilitate his image. So he went from the rough beer hall orator to some kind of PR creation. How did that even work?
Pretty much. Instead of trying to downplay his transient, rather lonely personal history, Hitler and his propaganda team actually started to foreground his personal life. Stratigakos explains he's being presented as a good man, a moral man, and the evidence for that comes from his private life.
Wow.
She emphasizes it's fabricated, but it's very effective. This was a really calculated strategy to appeal to a broader, more conservative audience, people who crave normalcy, stability.
So what did this fabricated private life look like?
It involves portraying him as this cultured gentleman, beloved by dogs and children, relaxing at his residence in Obersalzberg in Bavaria. Working with an architect, Gertie Troost, he created this space with a great hall that seems inspired by the artist salons of pre-World War I Munich. Very sophisticated image.
And the media bought into it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
German and even English language magazines printed these, like fluffy pieces on the Führer at home. Stratigakos even notes kind of incredibly, even the American Dog Kennel Gazette had this feature on Hitler as a dog lover.
You're kidding. The American Dog Kennel Gazette.
Not kidding. That's how pervasive it was.
Yeah.
And this strategy was so successful that Stratigakos points out the most sold images of 1934 were pictures of Hitler at home playing with his dogs or with children. It was a complete and utterly manufactured rebranding.
That's deeply unsettling. The idea that a totally fabricated domestic image could become so incredibly popular. But despite this polished image and his growing popularity, he actually lost the 1932 presidential election. So how did he make that final decisive leap to actually becoming dictator?
Yeah, he lost the election, but it speaks volumes about the fragility of democratic institutions when they're under immense pressure. He managed to gain the support of many influential industrial interests, key figures who saw him as maybe a bulwark against communism or just a strong leader who could restore order.
So even after losing the election, the political situation remained incredibly unstable. No one could form a government.
Precisely. When the parliamentary elections failed, again, to establish a majority government, Germany's aging president, the war hero Paul von Hindenburg, eventually caved to outside pressure from conservatives, industrialists, and he named Hitler chancellor in January 1933. It was a huge political miscalculation, really, driven by the establishment's fear of other alternatives like the communists.
And once he was chancellor, he moved incredibly fast, didn't he?
Unbelievably fast, within weeks. In February 1933, the Reichstag building, Germany's parliament, was set on fire. We still don't know definitively who did it, but that doesn't matter as much as how Hitler reacted.
How did he react?
He immediately used the fire as a pretext to seize emergency powers that allowed him to detain his political enemies without trial, particularly targeting communists initially. It was a direct, opportunistic assault on civil liberties.
And then came the Enabling Act.
Yes. With communists and other leftists already under arrest or intimidated, he pushed a law called the Enabling Act through the Reichstag. This act essentially allowed Hitler's cabinet to institute legislation without parliamentary consent. It effectively bypassed the democratic process entirely, gave him dictatorial powers legally.
And this wasn't just passed easily, was it? There must have been opposition.
There was, but the deck was heavily stacked by then. He secured the backing of the conservative German National People's Party, the DNVP. And crucially, the deputies from the left-leaning Social Democratic Party, the SPD, were largely barred from attending or intimidated into silence. So the proposal was passed by a vote of 444 votes to 94. It was, as Head calls it, a key step in usurping the democratic institutions of the state. It was essentially a legal coup.
A legal coup. That's chilling.
Yeah. And Dr. Het explains that right after this law came what the Nazis themselves called Gleichschaltung, coordination. This is a systematic, often brutal process where basically any organization at all that could possibly form a basis for opposition, think trade unions, youth groups, cultural clubs, everything, was either abolished or forcibly taken over by the Nazis.
Wiping out any potential dissent.
Completely. Het says this process was largely completed by July of 1933, when all political parties except the Nazis were formally outlawed. So the transformation from that failing artist, that non-entity, to an absolute dictator, often using the tools of the state itself, it was complete.
Wow.
So through this really chilling combination of unexpected talents like rhetoric, calculated political maneuvering, that strategic image management we talked about, and just leveraging the immense chaos and desperation of his era, the non-entity, the mediocrity, the failure, as Kershaw initially called him, became not only the Chancellor of Germany, but somehow a beloved celebrity to millions. The transformation was just staggering and complete.
It's truly incredible to trace that path from obscurity to absolute power. What stands out most to you about the unexpected factors, the things that really allowed someone so apparently unremarkable to achieve such immense and ultimately devastating power? And maybe more importantly for us today, how might examining this specific historical instance, this perfect storm, help us maybe recognize similar vulnerabilities? Vulnerabilities in our own societies or political landscapes where perhaps charisma, desperation, and that kind of calculated image management might intersect again.